He came to the swamps to outrun memories that had the persistence of ghosts. The mountains had been too loud, their echoes too similar to the sharp crack of rifle fire in a high, thin air. The desert had been too open, the horizon a constant reminder of distances he could not cross, of calls he could not answer. So he had chosen the water and the mud, the suffocating green of a Louisiana bayou where sound died, where the past might finally drown in the silt. His name was Elias Thorne, and he had once been the kind of man who led others into places like this. Now, he just wanted to be left alone. His cabin was little more than a box on stilts, pushed up against the murky edge of a waterway that had no name on any modern map. It was a place of beginnings and endings, where cypress trees dripped with Spanish moss that looked like the fraying nerves of the earth itself. The air, thick and wet, was a physical presence. It coated his skin, filled his lungs, and promised to decay anything left untended. For Elias, this was the appeal. He wanted to be untended. He wanted to decay, just enough to slough off the man he had been. He wore the same things every day, a uniform of his own design. An old olive M65 field jacket, its fabric softened by 1,000 washings and 100 rains, worn over a simple plaid flannel shirt. Faded cargo pants and a pair of leather boots that had molded to his feet over years of hard miles. On his wrist, a military-issue watch, its luminous dial a faint green glow in the perpetual twilight under the canopy. It was the only thing he owned that still kept perfect time. Everything else in his life felt approximate, misaligned. In the pocket of his jacket, a folding knife, its edge honed to a razor sharpness. On his back, when he moved through the swamp, an Eberly stock half-track pack, its pockets and straps arranged with a muscle memory that had outlived its purpose. He was 43, but his eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, held the vigilance of a much older man. They were eyes that had learned to see things in the dark, and now they saw darkness even in the light. He was not entirely alone. At his feet, lying on the weathered planks of the porch, was Kaiser. The dog was a German shepherd of advanced years, his muzzle a distinguished silver gray, his hips a little stiff in the mornings. He was no pet. Kaiser was a veteran, same as Elias. They had served together in places that were now just coordinates on a classified map. The dog had saved his life twice, and Elias had saved his once. It was a balanced ledger. Kaiser moved with the same quiet economy as his master. He didn't bark without reason. He didn't whine for attention. He observed, he assessed, he measured. He was never entirely off duty, and in the oppressive silence of the swamp, his presence was a grounding anchor for Elias's drifting thoughts. Their bond was a language of silence, a shift in the dog's weight, the subtle pivot of his ears, the rhythm of his breathing. These were communiques more eloquent than any spoken word. Elias understood them perfectly. He knew the low rumble in Kaiser's chest that meant a gator was sliding into the water nearby. He knew the soft sigh that was the dog's equivalent of a shrug. And he knew the rigid, absolute stillness that meant something was wrong. It happened on the third week, during a slow patrol along the property line Elias had marked with small, unobtrusive cuts on the cypress trees. The air was heavy, the cicadas a droning wall of sound. Elias was walking, his mind a blank slate, a state he actively cultivated. Then he felt it, the absence of sound beside him. He stopped. Kaiser was frozen, 20 feet back. He wasn't looking at anything. His head was raised, his black nose twitching, tasting the air. His body was a taut line of muscle, a statue of pure instinct. A low growl vibrated in his chest, so deep it was more a feeling than a sound. Elias went still, his own senses flaring to life. He scanned the tree line, the water's surface, the canopy above. He saw nothing. No movement, no snapping twig, no glint of foreign light. He listened past the insects. He heard only the slow suck of the mud and the drip of water from moss. But he trusted the dog. Kaiser's instincts had been calibrated in the world's most dangerous places. They were more reliable than satellite intel, more honest than a politician's promise. "What is it, boy?" Elias whispered, his voice a rustle of dry leaves. Kaiser didn't relax. He took a hesitant step forward, his nose still working the air. He wasn't tracking an animal. This was different. It was a scent of confusion, of anomaly. It was the smell of something that did not belong in the deep, organic memory of the swamp. The dog looked back at Elias, his dark eyes asking a question Elias couldn't answer. For the first time since they had arrived, the silence of the swamp felt less like a refuge and more like a secret. The unease settled in Elias's gut, a cold, familiar weight. He had come here to bury the past, but the ground beneath his feet, it seemed, was not as dead as he had hoped. Days passed. The moment of Kaiser's stillness lingered in Elias's mind, a splinter he couldn't remove. He became more watchful, his patrols less meditative and more like the reconnaissance sweeps of his former life. He noted the flight patterns of the egrets, the places where the water snakes sunned themselves. He was relearning the swamp's baseline, its natural rhythm, so he could better identify the dissonance Kaiser had detected. The dog remained quietly alert, a shadow of tense energy at Elias's heels. The air of peaceful decay had been replaced by a low hum of anticipation. The discovery came on a Tuesday. The sky was the color of a dull pewter, threatening a rain that never seemed to arrive. Elias had decided to push deeper into the southwestern quadrant of the property, a section he typically avoided. It was a waterlogged maze of cypress knees and thick black mud that could steal a boot if you weren't careful. He was following a game trail, the path faint and overgrown, when Kaiser broke formation. There was no warning, no preliminary signal. One moment the dog was at his customary position, just behind Elias's left leg. The next he was gone, a silent blur of black and tan moving with a startling burst of speed. He plunged into the thicket to their right, moving with a certainty that defied the treacherous terrain. Elias called his name, a sharp, low command. "Kaiser, heel." The dog ignored him. It was a breach of protocol so profound it sent a jolt of alarm through Elias. In all their years, Kaiser had never, not once, broken a direct command in the field. Elias pushed through the saw palmetto, the fronds scratching at his jacket. He found Kaiser 20 yards in, at the base of a monstrous, ancient cypress. The ground here was different. Instead of the usual soft muck, the earth was strangely firm, almost solid, forming an unnatural rise in the otherwise flat landscape. Kaiser was digging, not with the frantic energy of a dog after a rabbit, but with a focused, methodical purpose. Mud flew from his paws as he clawed at a specific spot nestled between two massive roots. Elias knelt, putting a hand on the dog's back. "Easy, boy. What have you got?" Kaiser stopped, panting, and looked from the hole to Elias, a clear and urgent message in his eyes. Elias reached into the shallow pit. His fingers brushed against something cold, hard, and unnaturally smooth. It wasn't a rock or a root. He worked his fingers around the object, clearing the thick, clay-like mud. He pulled it free. It was a piece of metal, about the size of his hand. It was painted a faded olive drab, and though it was caked in grime, he could make out stenciled letters, a partial serial number, and the blocky military-style text, "Danger." He ran his thumb over the edge. It was a sheared piece of aluminum alloy, thick and light, the kind used for an aircraft's skin. His training took over. All thoughts of isolation and peace evaporated, replaced by a cold, analytical focus. He stood up and surveyed the area with new eyes. The unnatural firmness of the ground, the way the vegetation grew differently on this slight mound. He unslung his pack and took out a long, thin pole he used as a walking staff and for probing uncertain ground. He began to push it into the mud around the spot where Kaiser had dug. 6 inches down, a foot down, the pole met soft resistance. But then, in a wider and wider circle around the mound, he began to hit something solid. Thump, thump, thump. A consistent, unyielding surface buried just beneath a few feet of silt and time. It was big, much bigger than a piece of debris. He spent the next hour methodically clearing mud and tangled roots with his hands and his knife. The shape began to reveal itself. A long, tapering boom, a mounting point for a stabilizer fin. And then, the unmistakable, gut-wrenching shape of a tail rotor, its blades bent and mangled, half swallowed by the earth. It was a helicopter, a Huey by the look of the tail assembly, a ghost sleeping in the swamp. Adrenaline, an old and unwelcome friend, coursed through him. This wasn't an archaeological find. This was a tomb. He worked his way along the buried fuselage, the water seeping into the hole as fast as he could clear it. He found a side cargo door, partially ajar. With the help of a pry bar from his pack, he managed to wrench it open with a groan of tortured metal. A wave of stagnant black water and silt washed out. The smell was of decay, but not just of leaves and wood. It was the smell of oil, of hydraulic fluid, of sealed-off time. He peered inside. The interior was a chaotic mess, filled almost to the top with a slurry of mud. He could make out the back of a pilot's seat. He reached in, his arm submerged to the shoulder in the cold, viscous liquid. His fingers found the seatbelt harness. He traced it to the buckle. It was intact. Then he traced the other strap. It wasn't broken or frayed. It was cut. A clean, deliberate slice through the thick webbing. He froze. A crash was one thing. A cut harness was another. It spoke of survival, at least for a time. It spoke of a conscious act. His eyes scanned the flooded cockpit. Wedged beneath the instrument panel, almost completely hidden, was a dark shape. A box. He had to contort his body, his face pressed against the cold metal of the door frame to reach it. His fingers found a handle. He pulled. It was stuck fast, held by the pressure of the mud. He set his feet, braced himself, and pulled again, this time with a surge of raw strength. It came free with a thick, sucking sound. He stumbled back, holding it. It was a Halliburton case, a waterproof, heavy-duty container, the kind used to transport sensitive equipment or documents. Its latches were still sealed. This wasn't debris. This was cargo. And its placement, tucked away under the panel, felt intentional. It felt like a message in a bottle, dropped into an ocean of mud and silence. Waiting. Elias looked from the case to the half-buried helicopter, then to Kaiser, who sat watching him, his breathing steady, his work done. The quiet of the swamp was gone. In its place was the loud, insistent hum of a story that demanded to be told. Back in the dim light of the cabin, the Halliburton case sat on his small wooden table like a judgment. Elias wiped the mud from its surface, his movements precise and economical. He ran his fingers over the latches, feeling the grit that had worked its way into the seams over decades. He found the serial number plate on the helicopter's tail boom and had written it down on a waterproof page in his field notebook. He now copied the numbers from the plate onto another page next to the words UH-1H. A Huey, a workhorse of a bygone era. His first instinct, the one drilled into him by years of service, was to report it. Call it in. A single radio transmission, and this would become someone else's problem. But he hesitated. The cut harness. The deliberately hidden case. His past had taught him that the official version of a story was often the least true. He had been a part of crafting those official versions, of burying inconvenient facts under layers of redacted reports and carefully worded press releases. He had seen how easily a hero could be turned into a statistic, a sacrifice, into a training accident. He owed the ghost in the swamp more than a phone call. He needed to know the truth before he handed this secret over to the people who might have a vested interest in keeping it buried. He decided to start with the land itself. The next morning, he left Kaiser on the porch with a fresh bowl of water and a quiet command to watch the house. The dog settled onto the planks, his gaze fixed on the waterway, a silent, furry sentinel. Elias drove his old, dusty truck down the long gravel track that led back to civilization. The journey to the parish seat of St. Jude, a sleepy town clinging to the banks of a larger bayou, took over an hour. The St. Jude Parish Clerk's office was housed in a brick building from the 1930s, cooled by a window-mounted air conditioner that rattled with heroic effort. Inside, the air smelled of old paper, floor wax, and weak coffee. Behind a high wooden counter stood a woman in her late 50s or early 60s. She was tall and spare, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. A pair of reading glasses was perched on the end of her nose. Her nameplate read, Martha Guidry, Parish Clerk. She watched him approach with an expression of neutral appraisal. Elias felt her gaze cataloging his worn jacket, his guarded posture, the quiet intensity in his eyes. He was an outsider, and in a town like St. Jude, that was a fact noted by all. "Can I help you?" Her voice was low and businesslike, with the distinctive cadence of the local accent. "I'd like to see some old survey maps," Elias said, his own voice sounding rough from disuse. "From the late 70s, for the area west of the Coupe Bayou." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "That's mostly undeveloped land. Federal holdings back then. What's your interest?" "I own a parcel out there," he replied, keeping his voice even. "Just trying to understand my property lines." It was a plausible lie, but he could tell she didn't fully believe it. She gave a slow nod, a gesture that conceded his right to ask, if not her approval of his motives. She disappeared for a few minutes into a back room filled with rolling shelves of massive, bound volumes. She returned with a dusty tome nearly 3 feet wide and laid it on the counter with a heavy thud. "This is the plat book for 1975 through 1980. Be careful with it. The pages are brittle." Elias spent the next hour hunched over the book, the scent of aging paper filling his nostrils. He carefully turned the large, crackling pages, his fingers tracing the hand-drawn lines that divided the parish into a patchwork of ownership. He found his small plot, an insignificant square surrounded by a vast, empty space labeled simply U.S. government land, unsurveyed. He kept turning the pages, moving forward in time. For years, the designation remained the same. Then, in a newer digital print book from 2 years ago, he found it. The vast tract of federal land had been sold, transferred in a single massive block to a private entity. The new owner was listed as Patriot Development Corporation. The name felt hollow, jingoistic. "Find what you were looking for?" Martha Guidry had approached the counter silently. Elias pointed to the page. "This sale, Patriot Development, was that a local matter?" She looked at the map, and a flicker of something, distaste perhaps, crossed her face. "Hardly. That was a federal land transfer, pushed through from Washington, supposed to be for economic revitalization, So far, all they've done is put up no trespassing signs and fly a few survey drones. A lot of folks weren't happy about it. That land has been wild for 200 years. Elias felt the pieces clicking into place. A secret sale. A corporation with a patriotic-sounding name. He looked at Martha Guidry, sensing a deep-rooted integrity beneath her stern exterior. He decided to take a small risk. "I'm looking into something else," he said, his voice dropping lower. "An old military incident. A crash. From around 78. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened with new interest. She studied his face for a long moment. "You've got the look of a man who's seen a thing or two. Army? Marines?" "Something like that," Elias deflected. She seemed to accept the non-answer. "If you're asking about military history in this parish, there's only one person to talk to. Dr. Alistair Finch, retired history professor from LSU, lives just outside of town, knows every plane that ever went down in this state and the story behind it." She wrote an address on a small slip of paper and pushed it across the counter. "You tell him Martha sent you. And you be careful, you hear? Digging up old stories around here can be like stirring up a nest of cottonmouths." Dr. Finch lived in a small house overrun with books and bougainvillea. The man himself was in his 70s, with a shock of untamed white hair, bright, inquisitive eyes behind thick glasses, and an infectious, almost manic energy. His living room was not a living room. It was an archive. Maps were tacked to the walls, model airplanes hung from the ceiling, and every flat surface was covered in stacks of books, binders, and declassified documents. Elias explained he was a history enthusiast, a thin cover story, and mentioned the parcel of land he had found. He gave Finch the aircraft type and the serial number he had copied from the tail boom. Finch's eyes lit up with the fire of pure academic passion. "A Huey! A UH-1H from that period. Let's see. He scurried over to a filing cabinet and pulled out a thick binder labeled U.S. Army Aviation Mishaps, 1970 to 1980. He licked his thumb and began flipping through pages with practiced speed. "Ah, here we are. Serial number matches." He squinted at the page. "But that's impossible." "What is?" Elias asked, his own heart rate quickening. "According to the official report," Finch said, tapping the page with a gnarled finger, "this aircraft, call sign Whippoorwill, went down during a routine training exercise over the Gulf of Mexico, August 14th, 1978. Severe unexpected squall line. They lost radio contact. An extensive search and rescue operation found some floating debris, a helmet, a life vest, but the wreckage and the pilot were never recovered. Declared lost at sea." Finch looked up at Elias, his academic curiosity now warring with confusion. "If this report is accurate, that helicopter should be at the bottom of the Gulf, 70 miles south of here. Not in a swamp in St. Jude Parish." The words hung in the air, thick with implication. Lost at sea. But Elias had touched it. It was real, and it was in the swamp. The official story was a lie. A clean, simple lie to cover a messy, complicated truth. "Who was the pilot?" Elias asked, his voice tight. Finch consulted the report. "A Captain Eva Rostova, a real trailblazer from what I remember. One of the first women to fly rotary wing aircraft in a non-combat role for the Army. A brilliant record. Such a tragedy." Eva Rostova. The name had a weight, a reality that the anonymous ghost in the swamp had lacked. Elias felt a sudden, sharp sense of connection, of duty. He thanked Dr. Finch for his time, leaving the old historian buzzing with the thrill of a historical contradiction. Back at his cabin, as dusk bled through the trees, Elias placed the Halliburton case back on the table. He no longer saw it as a piece of evidence. He saw it as a last will and testament. Using his knife, he carefully worked at the seals which had degraded with time. With a final pop of compressed air, the case opened. The contents were perfectly preserved. On top lay a standard-issue pilot's logbook. Beneath it, a small leather pouch containing a few personal items. A black and white photo of a young couple, a silver locket, and a folded, creased letter. At the very bottom of the case was a small reel-to-reel audio tape recorder and a single 5-inch tape, its leader carefully secured. Elias owned an old battery-powered reel-to-reel player, a relic he'd picked up at a flea market for listening to old blues recordings. He retrieved it from a shelf, his hands moving with unsteady reverence. He threaded the fragile brown tape onto the spools. He took a deep breath, the way he used to before breaching a door, and pressed the play button. There was a hiss of static, then a click, and then a voice. It was a woman's voice, clear and calm, with an undercurrent of exhaustion. There were no background noises, no sound of a struggling engine or whipping wind. Just the voice, speaking into a profound silence. August 15th, 1978. This is Captain Eva Rostova. If anyone is hearing this, my aircraft, call sign Whippoorwill, is down. Location approximately 40 miles northwest of the designated flight path. The crash was not an accident. Elias leaned forward, his entire being focused on the voice emerging from the past. My passenger, Dr. Miles Corbin, a geologist with the Army Corps of Engineers, is dead. He was killed before the crash. My flight plan was falsified. We were not on a training mission. Dr. Corbin had discovered evidence. Soil and water samples from the area designated for the future West Delta Proving Ground. He told me they showed catastrophic levels of chemical contamination, dioxins, heavy metals, byproducts of a chemical defoliant program, supposedly discontinued. He said a corporate partner, a company called Sterling Vance, was dumping waste under the cover of a government contract. Sterling Vance. The name echoed in Elias's mind, a precursor to the hollow patriotism of Patriot Development. We were forced down, her voice continued, steady despite the gravity of her words. A small charge on the tail rotor hydraulics. It was sabotage. I managed to auto-rotate into the swamp. I survived the impact. Corbin did not. I am injured. My leg is broken. I can't move far. They will be coming for me. Not to rescue me, to silence me. I've hidden Corbin's research in a separate container. But this tape, this is my testimony. There was a pause. When she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its military precision. It was softer, deeply human. To my husband, Michael, I love you. Don't let them tell you this was an accident. Don't let them tell you I was lost. I am here. Tell our story. Tell them. Whippoorwill is down, but not out. The tape hissed for a few more seconds and then went silent. Elias sat motionless in the gathering dark. The calm, determined voice of Captain Eva Rostova echoing in the small cabin. It was the voice of a soldier doing her duty to the very end. It was a voice from a tomb, asking for justice. And it sounded hauntingly like the voice he had heard on his radio years ago, the one he had been ordered to ignore, the one that had followed him into his exile. He looked down at his hands. He had come to this swamp to be forgotten, but a ghost had just handed him a mission. The following afternoon, a vehicle approached on the gravel road, its engine a foreign intrusion in the swamp's symphony of natural sounds. Elias, who had been sitting on his porch cleaning his rifle with a slow, meditative rhythm, stopped his work. Kaiser, lying at his feet, lifted his head, a low growl rumbling in his chest before Elias silenced him with a quiet hand signal. The dog subsided, but his body remained tense, a coiled spring of suspicion. A cloud of dust announced the arrival of a pristine black SUV, the kind of vehicle that belonged in a corporate parking garage, not on a dirt track in the middle of nowhere. It rolled to a stop 50 feet from the cabin. The driver's door opened, and a man emerged. He was in his late 40s or early 50s, dressed in a crisp, light gray suit, a stark and absurd contrast to the humid, muddy environment. He moved with a smooth, practiced confidence, his polished shoes somehow avoiding the worst of the dust. He was the physical embodiment of the world Elias had tried to escape. The man walked toward the porch, stopping at the bottom of the steps. He smiled, a polite, frictionless expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Thorne? Elias Thorne?" Elias didn't answer. He simply watched, his face impassive, his hands resting on the components of his rifle laid out on a cloth before him. The man's smile didn't waver. "My name is Sterling. I represent the Patriot Development Corporation. We're the primary landowners out here now." He gestured vaguely at the swamp around them. "I understand you recently acquired this small parcel. Just wanted to come by and introduce myself. Neighbor to neighbor, so to speak." "We're not neighbors," Elias said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Sterling gave a small, indulgent chuckle. "Fair enough. Look, I'll be direct. We're in the initial phases of a major land reclamation project. Environmental surveys, geological assessments. It's going to get busy out here. A lot of heavy equipment, personnel. Not exactly the peace and quiet I imagine you were looking for when you bought this place." He paused, letting the implication hang in the thick air. "So," he continued, "my company has authorized me to make you a generous offer. We'll buy your parcel, well above market value, save you the trouble of being our neighbor, and put a tidy sum in your pocket. You could buy a much nicer piece of land, somewhere drier." Elias slowly picked up the rifle's bolt, wiping it with an oiled cloth. He didn't look at Sterling. "I'm not selling." Sterling's pleasant facade tightened almost imperceptibly at the edges. "Mr. Thorne, perhaps you don't understand the scope of our project. We have permits, federal backing. This entire area will be transformed. The work we're doing is vital. Frankly, your presence here is an inconvenience, one we're willing to pay handsomely to resolve." "I'm not selling," Elias repeated, his voice unchanged. He slid the bolt back into the receiver of the rifle with a soft, metallic click. The sound was quiet, but it seemed to echo in the space between them. Sterling's tone shifted. The thin veneer of civility began to peel back, revealing the hard condescension beneath. "Let me be even more direct. We've had reports of trespassing on our property. Survey markers have been disturbed. We take our property rights very seriously. Whatever you think you're doing out here, whatever you think you may have found, it's just mud and rust, Mr. Thorne. Relics of a past that is best left buried. This land is worthless. We're making it valuable again." Elias finally lifted his eyes and met Sterling's gaze. The pale blue of his eyes was as cold and hard as glacial ice. He reached beside him and picked up the pilot's logbook he had recovered from the case. He held it up slightly. "Her name was Eva Rostova," Elias said, his voice low and clear. The effect was immediate and profound. For a split second, Sterling's mask of cool control shattered. A flicker of raw, undisguised shock and something akin to fear flashed in his eyes. His jaw tightened. He recovered quickly, but the damage was done. Elias had his confirmation. Sterling Vance, Patriot Development. It was all the same entity. A monster that had simply changed its skin. I don't know what you're talking about, Sterling said, his voice now clipped and sharp. You're a squatter on the edge of a multi-billion-dollar project. You'd be wise to reconsider my offer. There are other ways to deal with obstacles, legal avenues that can be quite unpleasant. He turned to leave, his polite threats hanging in the air like poison. As he took his first step away from the porch, Kaiser, who had been lying perfectly still throughout the entire exchange, rose to his feet. He didn't bark. He didn't lunge. He simply stood, a silent, imposing figure at the top of the stairs. The fur along his spine bristled, and a deep, guttural growl emanated from his chest. It was not the sound of an angry dog. It was the sound of a weapons system arming. It was a declaration of lethal intent. Controlled and absolute. Sterling froze, his back to them. He turned his head slowly, his eyes wide with a primal fear he couldn't conceal. He looked at the dog, at the unwavering, intelligent menace in its gaze. He was a man who dealt in threats, in leverage and intimidation. But this was a language he understood on a cellular level. This was a threat that didn't need lawyers. Without another word, Sterling turned and walked stiffly back to his SUV. He got in, his movements jerky, and drove away, much faster this time, the cloud of dust a testament to his hasty retreat. Elias watched him go, then put a reassuring hand on Kaiser's head. The growl ceased, the fur settled, but the dog remained standing, watching the road until the sound of the engine had faded completely. The swamp was quiet again, but the battle lines had been drawn. The polite threat had been delivered, and the silent promise of violence had been returned. Elias knew that men like Sterling didn't give up. They didn't walk away. They escalated. And as he looked toward the darkening sky, he saw the first telltale signs of the brewing storm, a bruised purple stain spreading from the Gulf. The escalation, he suspected, would come sooner than he thought. The storm arrived with the dawn, not as a sudden onslaught, but as a slow, menacing creep. The sky, which had been a bruised purple, deepened to a charcoal gray. The wind began to sigh through the cypress trees, a low, mournful sound that carried the salty tang of the distant Gulf. The air grew heavy, charged with electricity, and the usual chorus of insects and frogs fell silent, cowering before the approaching fury. It was the kind of weather that frayed nerves and provided cover for dark deeds. Elias stood on his porch, watching the water ripple and churn. He knew Sterling would use this. The storm would mask the noise of engines, the churn of machinery. It would wash away evidence. He had one chance to get Captain Rostova's story out. He had to get the tape to Martha Guidry and Dr. Finch. They were the only people he could trust, an anchor of integrity in a sea of deceit. He had spent the night preparing. He'd waterproofed the tape and the logbook, sealing them in multiple layers of plastic and tucking them deep inside his pack. He had charted a course, not by road, but through the swamp itself, a difficult, treacherous route that would be his best chance of avoiding Sterling's men. He checked his gear one last time. Knife, compass, a small emergency medical kit. Loyalty. He was choosing to honor the loyalty of a long-dead pilot. As the first fat drops of rain began to fall, he saw it. A low, flat-bottomed barge, pushed by a powerful tugboat, was nosing its way up a wide channel about a half-mile away. On its deck, shrouded in tarps, was the unmistakable shape of a dredging crane and other heavy equipment. Sterling was there, a small figure in a yellow rain slicker, directing a crew of rough-looking men. They were establishing a staging area, their target clear, the small, unnatural mound where Whippoorwill lay buried. Elias slung his pack over his shoulders. Kaiser was at his side, alert and whining softly, sensing the urgency and the threat. "It's time to go, boy," Elias said, giving the dog a quick scratch behind the ears. Stay close." He was about to step off the porch and melt into the tree line when he saw movement from the barge. Two of Sterling's men had disembarked in a small aluminum skiff and were heading directly for the crash site, moving with a grim purpose. They were going to secure the location, to mark it for the dredge. A conflict ignited within Elias. His mission was to get the tape out. That was the strategic objective. Engaging those men was a tactical risk, a diversion he couldn't afford. The cold logic of his training screamed at him. Evade and escape. The mission comes first. But as he watched them, a protective, territorial anger rose in him. They were invaders, come to desecrate a grave. Before he could weigh his options, Kaiser made the decision for him. With a low woof, the dog shot off the porch, a black and tan streak against the gray landscape. He wasn't running toward the men to attack, but to distract. He began to bark loudly, circling the area around the hidden helicopter, drawing their attention, pulling them away from the direct path to the wreckage. It was a classic canine tactic to create a diversion, to protect a handler's position. "Kaiser, no!" Elias hissed. The two men, startled by the sudden appearance of the large, barking dog, stopped. One of them raised a heavy wrench he was carrying. "Get out of here, you stupid mutt!" he yelled over the rising wind. Kaiser held his ground, his barking growing more ferocious. He was buying Elias time, creating an opening. Elias saw it, the tactical advantage the dog was creating. He could slip away now, unseen. It was the smart move, the professional move. And then the memory hit him. It wasn't a gentle recollection, it was a full-body flashback, a sensory assault. The smell of cordite and hot dust, the deafening rattle of automatic fire, the sun beating down on a mud brick wall, and a voice in his ear, ragged with pain, crackling over the radio. "Elias, I'm hit. I'm pinned down. Can you—" And his own voice, cold and distant, answering his commanding officer. "Understood. We're proceeding to the objective." The mission. He had chosen the mission. He had followed his orders. He had left a man behind, and the silence that followed on the radio was a sound he had never been able to forget. He looked from his escape route, the path to his objective, to his partner. Kaiser was still barking, holding the men at bay. The wind howled, tearing at the trees. The rain was coming down harder now, cold and stinging. One of the men, his patience gone, took a step forward and swung the heavy wrench in a wide, vicious arc. He didn't mean to connect. He meant to scare the dog off. But the ground was slick with mud, and his foot slipped as he swung. The wrench, instead of whistling through the air, caught Kaiser squarely on his flank with a sickening thud. The dog let out a sharp yelp of pain and crumpled to the ground. He tried to get up, his hind legs scrambling in the mud, but he couldn't. He collapsed again, whining, a sound of betrayal and agony. Elias froze. Everything stopped. The wind, the rain, the men, the mission. All of it faded into a dull, gray roar. The only thing in the world was his dog, his partner, lying injured in the mud. The tape in his pack felt like a block of ice against his back. The objective, the logbook, Captain Rostova's last wish. His past and his present collided in that single, terrible moment. He could still go. He could still succeed. He could leave the dog, save the mission, and live with the consequences. Again. But the man who had walked into this swamp was not the same man who stood here now. The silence he had sought had been filled by the voice of a dead pilot and the steady, loyal presence of his dog. He had come here to forget what it meant to be responsible for someone. He had failed. He made the opposite choice. With a roar of pure, unthinking rage, he turned his back on his escape. He abandoned the mission. He charged out from the cover of the trees, straight toward the two men. He was no longer a ghost. He was a storm. He moved with a speed and violence that was terrifying to behold. The two men who had been laughing at the injured dog turned to see him coming, and the laughter died in their throats. He didn't need his rifle. His body was the only weapon required. He hit the first man with his shoulder, a full-force impact that lifted him off his feet and sent him sprawling into the brackish water. The second man swung the wrench, but Elias was already inside the arc of the blow. He deflected the man's arm, spun him around, and drove him face first into the mud. He didn't stop to see if they were conscious. His only focus was Kaiser. He reached the dog's side, his heart pounding with a fear he hadn't felt in years. "Kaiser, I'm here, boy. I'm here." He ran his hands gently over the dog's flank. There was a deep bruise, and he could feel the unnatural give of broken ribs, but the wound wasn't bleeding heavily. The dog whimpered, licking his hand, his eyes filled with pain, but also with unwavering trust. Elias carefully scooped the heavy dog into his arms. The weight was immense, a deadening burden, but he held on. He would not leave him behind. He would not fail another partner. As he stood there in the driving rain, holding his injured friend, he looked up toward the barge. Sterling was watching through binoculars, his face a mask of fury. He was shouting orders, urging his men forward. But as Elias looked, he saw one of the crewmen, a younger man named Davis he'd noticed earlier, hesitate. Davis had the same look as many of the green recruits Elias had trained, a mix of fear and a desperate desire to do the right thing. He had seen the whole thing, the dog's bravery, the brutal swing of the wrench, Elias's ferocious loyalty. Their eyes locked across the churning water. In that moment, Elias's choice, that raw, selfless act of staying, had become its own mission, its own message. Sterling was screaming at Davis to get the crane started. Davis, with a look of sudden resolve, stumbled near a collection of hydraulic lines. He accidentally kicked a valve handle, then fell against a crucial-looking hose fitting. There was a loud pop and a spray of hydraulic fluid. The massive arm of the crane, which had been starting to lift, sagged and died with a groan of protesting metal. At that exact moment, two sets of headlights cut through the gray curtain of the storm. A white, parish-owned truck, its emergency lights flashing, bumped and slid down the muddy track, followed by a battered old sedan. Martha Guidry was behind the wheel of the truck, her face set with grim determination. Dr. Finch was in the car behind her. Davis had bought them time. Elias's choice had turned the tide. Holding Kaiser tight against his chest, Elias turned his back on Sterling and began to walk toward the approaching lights, toward the world he had tried so hard to leave behind. The tape was still in his pack, but the real testimony was the weight of the loyal animal in his arms. He had finally chosen to stay. The morning after the storm was unnaturally calm. The air, washed clean by the torrential rain, felt thin and cool. A gentle mist rose from the swamp, shrouding the cypress trees in a soft, ethereal light. The chaos of the previous day had been replaced by a quiet, methodical order. The area around the half-buried helicopter was cordoned off with official yellow tape. State police cruisers were parked discreetly on the nearest patch of solid ground, their presence a symbol of a power that had decisively trumped Sterling's corporate authority. Elias sat on his porch, the same spot where he had confronted Sterling. But everything was different. The rifle was put away. In its place was a small bowl of antiseptic wash and clean bandages. Kaiser lay on a thick blanket at his feet, his flank shaved and stitched. The parish veterinarian had come out late last night, a favor to Martha Guidry. 2 broken ribs and deep bruising. He would be sore for weeks, but he would heal. The dog sighed softly in his sleep, his paws twitching as if dreaming of the chase. Elias watched a team of military personnel, a forensic recovery unit, working at the crash site. They moved with a quiet reverence, their actions precise and respectful. They were not there to dredge and destroy. They were there to excavate and honor. Captain Rostova's grave was no longer a secret. It was now a scene of remembrance. Nearby, Martha Guidry was speaking with a state police captain, pointing at the dead crane on the barge. Dr. Finch was already talking to a young Army officer, his hands flying as he explained the historical significance of the find, his voice filled with a vindicated passion. Sterling was there too. He stood off to the side, his expensive suit rumpled and stained with mud, his face a pale, slack mask of defeat. He was no longer giving orders. He was answering questions, his voice low and indistinct. A man from the Environmental Protection Agency stood beside him, holding a clipboard. The power Sterling had wielded, the power of money and influence, had evaporated in the face of a simple, undeniable truth. He was just a man in a ruined suit, stripped of his authority, about to be consumed by the bureaucratic machine he had tried to master. Elias felt a quiet sense of closure, but not of triumph. He had not sought this fight, but by choosing to finish it, he felt a shifting of the tectonic plates of his own soul. The guilt he carried, the weight of his past failure, had not vanished, but it no longer had him in a chokehold. It was simply a part of him now, a scar he could touch without flinching. He heard the sound of another car approaching, a slow, hesitant sound, unlike the aggressive confidence of Sterling's SUV or the official purpose of the police cruisers. A modest rental sedan, gray and anonymous, pulled to a stop near his cabin. The driver's door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was in her late 30s, with the same pale blue eyes as Elias, and a face etched with a familiar worry. It was his sister, Hannah. He hadn't seen her in 3 years, hadn't spoken to her in 2. Their last conversation had been a stilted, painful phone call, where his silence had been a wall she could not breach. He had pushed her away, along with the rest of the world. Now she stood at the edge of his self-imposed exile, looking uncertain and afraid, as if approaching a wild animal. Martha Guidry, it turned out, had a knack for finding people. After Elias had handed her the tape and told her the whole story the night before, while the vet was tending to Kaiser, she had looked at him with her perceptive eyes. "You're carrying more than that dog, Mr. Thorne," she had said. "Sometimes the heaviest things are the ones we ought to share." She had asked if there was anyone she should call. In a moment of exhaustion and release, he had given her his sister's name. Hannah walked slowly toward the porch. Elias didn't rise. He just watched her come. He saw the years of his absence reflected in her face. "Elias?" she said, her voice tentative. He had expected to feel the old urge to retreat, to shut down, to offer nothing. But it wasn't there. He simply felt tired. And beneath the tiredness, a flicker of something else. A quiet recognition of a bond that had been stretched, but not broken. He gave a slow nod. "Hannah." She stopped at the bottom of the steps, the same spot where Sterling had stood. She looked at the sleeping dog, the bandages, the quiet authority of the scene unfolding in the background. "The clerk, Martha, she told me a little. She said you did a good thing." "I had help," he said, gesturing with his head toward Kaiser. An awkward silence fell between them, filled with the ghosts of unspoken words. Hannah twisted a strap on her purse. "I was worried," she finally said, her voice thick with emotion. "When you left, we were all so worried." Elias looked down at his hands. He remembered the man who had left, the man running from the wreckage of his own life. He looked up and met his sister's gaze, and for the first time in years, He didn't look away. He didn't flinch from the pain and love he saw there. "I'm glad you came," he said. It was a simple sentence, but for him, it was a seismic shift. It was an admission, an opening, a first step back. Hannah's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled, a real smile. She came up the steps and, after a moment's hesitation, put her hand on his shoulder. He didn't pull away. Later that day, the Army officer in charge of the recovery team approached him. He formally thanked Elias for his integrity. He informed him that Captain Rostova's remains would be recovered and returned to her family for burial with full military honors. Her name would be cleared, her story told. The land, now evidence in a massive federal investigation, would never be developed. There was a movement, started by Dr. Finch and championed by Martha Guidry, to have it designated as a national wildlife preserve. They wanted to name it the Rostova Wilderness Area. "We've also been asked," the officer said, his tone respectful. "Given your unique familiarity with the terrain and your service background, if you would consider staying on as the official warden." Elias looked out at the swamp. It was no longer a place to hide. It had become a place of purpose. It was a place that held the story of a soldier's final, defiant act of loyalty. It was the place where he had finally learned to do the same. He looked at Kaiser, who was now awake, his head resting on his paws, his gaze fixed on Elias. He looked at his sister, who was watching him, a hopeful light in her eyes. "I will," Elias said. The words felt right. They felt like coming home. Months later, the heat of late summer had settled back over the swamp, a familiar, heavy blanket. But for Elias, the air felt different. It felt breathable. He was poling a flat-bottomed skiff through a narrow, winding waterway, the dark water parting silently before him. The sounds of the bayou were no longer a drone to be ignored, but a language he was slowly learning to speak. The splash of a turtle sliding off a log, the cry of a hawk circling overhead, the rustle of an unseen creature in the reeds. Kaiser sat at the bow of the skiff, a noble figurehead. His muzzle was as gray as ever, and he still moved with a slight stiffness from his injury, but his eyes were bright and clear. He was on duty, his head turning to mark the flight of a heron, his ears twitching at the buzz of a dragonfly. He was content. His partner was back. Elias wore his olive field jacket, but it hung differently on his shoulders now. It was no longer the armor of a man in hiding, but the comfortable uniform of a man who belonged. The watch on his wrist still kept perfect time, but he no longer felt out of sync with the world around him. He felt its rhythm in the slow push of the pole, in the steady beat of his own heart. He guided the skiff into a quiet, sun-dappled cove. At the water's edge, nestled amongst the cypress knees, stood a simple, unadorned granite marker. It was the place where Whippoorwill had come to rest. The inscription was brief. Captain Eva Rostova, U.S. Army, August 15th, 1978. She told the truth. Elias stopped the skiff, letting it drift. He looked at the memorial, a quiet testament to a courage that had refused to be buried. He had helped tell her story, and in doing so, he had begun to rewrite his own. His sister had visited twice more, their conversations growing easier, longer. He had spoken to his parents. He had started to rebuild the bridges he had burned in his retreat from the world. He looked over the side of the skiff at his own reflection in the still, dark water. The face that looked back was still weathered, the eyes still watchful. But the haunted, hunted look was gone. It had been replaced by a quiet resolve, a sense of earned peace. He didn't flinch from the image. He simply held its gaze. He had come to the swamp seeking an ending, a place to let his old life die. Instead, he had found a beginning. He had discovered that redemption wasn't about outrunning the past. It was about finding the courage to stand your ground, to answer the call for help, to choose loyalty when it was the hardest thing to do. It was about staying. With a final, quiet nod to the memorial, Elias picked up his pole. He pushed off from the bank, the skiff sliding back into the main channel. He had patrols to run, a wilderness to watch over, a promise to keep. Kaiser shifted his weight, looking ahead, ready for whatever came next. Together, they moved deeper into the swamp, two veterans who had finally found their way home. The silence that surrounded them was no longer empty. It was full of life.